Hello, and welcome back to day 2 of the 2021 National ALS Association Virtual Advocacy Conference. So for those of you that joined us yesterday, I hope you really enjoyed the day. For those of you who maybe were not able to join us, welcome to day 2. We had a really great first day. My name is Kalanit Balas, and I have the privilege and honor of being the president and CEO of the ALS Association. And yesterday we heard some amazing information, and I don't know about you, but I went home and really thought about the conversations with both Carrie and Troy and all the things that they were talking about, what it being livable, ALS being a livable disease means to them. And I'm carrying that into today and into the next day. So I hope you found great information with that, maybe companionship with that. Like, we have about, I think, 900 of our closest friends with us, even though you might be home technically alone. You're not, because we have so many people here today. We also heard a lot about finding new treatments and cures and what those essential 3 pillars are for making ALS a livable disease. Conversations with Dr. Jinsey Andrews and Neil Thacker. So I think today is going to be also a banner day because we've got some really, really great deep conversation to have with you. So first, I'd like to turn the virtual microphone over to Dr. Kuldip Dave, who is the ALS Association's Vice President for Research, and he's going to give you a little layout on how the day is going to go over the next hour and a half or so. So Kuldip, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Kalanit. So today's focus is another essential pillar of our strategic plan. We call it Prevent or Delay Harms of ALS. This is a new concept for our research ecosystem. So I'll in a few minutes go through what that means and how do we achieve that. We'll also hear from Representative Diane DeGette from Colorado, and we'll discuss issues like funding for the biorepository, the National ALS Registry, and how NIH funding is needed to connect the dots and fill in the missing pieces of the puzzle. Please, just a housekeeping item for everybody, please be sure to take note of your questions as the session progresses, and we'll end the day again with a live Q&A panel. And when we come back from the break, we'll also hear from a researcher, a person living with ALS, and someone on our staff here, and we'll dive into the larger issues around preventing and delaying harms of ALS. Back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Kuldip. So as I said, I think it's going to be a really good day. I really can't wait to hear the conversation with the Congresswoman and a couple other gems that we have for you. But first, you see the slide next to me. Yesterday, I mentioned that we're always grateful for our sponsors, not just for their support financially, but also for their partnership in this fight against ALS. So I first want to thank our gold level sponsors that include Alexion, Amylyx, Biogen, Biohaven, Genentech, and Per Mobile Foundation. Thank you all for everything that you do to help support the community. And additionally, I'd like to thank our exhibitor level sponsors, which include Apellis, Clean, Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America, PRC Saltillo, and Soleo Health. So again, thank you for your continued partnership in this fight. So with that, Kuldip is, I think, going to go down that kind of rabbit hole of this new conversation he was talking about, which is preventing or delaying harms of ALS. I think this is kind of a new conversation that we've been having, not only at the ALS Association, but throughout the whole community. We heard yesterday that those harms really fall in a few different pillars. You heard from Carrie and from Troy just a few examples of how they have experienced this, not only for themselves, but for their families, both those emotional, financial harms on top of the physical issues that people with ALS and their loved ones face. So Kuldip, do you want to talk a little bit more about that and take our community through that conversation? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kalanit. So if we could go to the next slide. And I think this slide is what you saw yesterday. This is our strategic goal by 2030 to make ALS a livable disease. And what this means is longer lives, improved quality of life, preventing loved ones from getting ALS. And how we get there is that we find new treatments and cures, we optimize current treatments and care, and what I'm going to talk about today, which is preventing or delaying harms associated with ALS. So, as I said, prevention is a new concept for ALS in our ecosystem. Think about it. We talk about prevention when it comes to our heart health all the time. I'm going on a diet. I'm eating fat-free or gluten-free foods. I exercise, cardio, walking. We talk about cholesterol, LDL levels. Prevention of heart disease is all around us. We do not talk about prevention of ALS in the same way. And just like for heart disease, we say we don't do X or we do Y. For heart disease, can research in ALS start to define what that X and Y is for ALS? The other challenge when we talk about prevention is that it seems like an abstract idea. It's somewhat removed. It's someone out there who may or may not get ALS. But this is about preventing our loved ones from getting it. It may be a sibling that you share your genetics with. It may be a friend who you swam in the lake with. It may be a coworker that worked with you in the chemical plant. It may be a spouse with whom you enjoyed eating a particular kind of food. This is not abstract. We know that genetics, environment, diet, these can be risk factors for neurological diseases. And so it could be really anyone. And you'll hear from Dr. Brian Traynor and his work around incidence of ALS later, and estimates on how ALS diagnosis is going to increase over the next 2 decades. And this is why we need to prioritize prevention research now, so that we can avoid or intervene early and reduce the risk of people getting ALS. So how do we get there? We get there by identifying new risk factors and causes for ALS. And as I said, these risk factors could be genetic, they could be environmental, they could be occupational, they could be dietary, who knows what. And let me give you some examples of how knowing these risk factors helps us with prevention. All around us, this is happening. I'll walk you through 3 very different examples outside of the ALS space, but I want you to imagine these scenarios for ALS. So the first one is a genetics example here on your left side. And let's talk about Down syndrome. It's the most common genetic disorder in the United States. As we know, pregnant women are routinely offered screening to see if their baby is at increased chance of Down syndrome. There are screening and diagnostic prenatal tests. Now, there is no cure for Down syndrome yet. However, it prepares the parents for early intervention, and recent medical advances as well as cultural and institutional support provides many opportunities to help overcome the challenges of this condition. Here, a genetic risk allows for early intervention program for infants, special education, socialization, all of which have dramatically improved the lifespan of people with Down syndrome. Let's move to the one in the center here, the environmental risk factor, and think about asbestos as a risk for lung disease. Asbestos is, we've all heard about this, right? It has the ability to break down into microscopically thin fibers. These fibers can remain airborne, and when individuals breathe in these fibers, they travel deep into the lung tissues and cause lung cancer, mesothelioma. No amount is considered safe. Dose-related asbestos exposure means the more you breathe, the more likely you breathe in, the more likely you're about to get sick. So asbestos workers' families have gotten mesothelioma from the dust the workers brought home on their clothes. Talk about loved ones getting the disease. But because of this information and what we have been able to get on asbestos, now, while it is not banned in the US, it is highly regulated by OSHA and EPA to protect and prevent people from dangers of asbestos exposure. Let's go one more down to the right, and this is an occupational risk factor. We all remember 9/11, and let's talk about those responders and workers who went in to clean up. The dust from the collapsed towers was toxic with thousands of contaminants, and these exposures led to debilitating illnesses among rescue, recovery, and cleanup workers. This knowledge has led to thinking about guidance and regulations around how handling and cleanup procedures happen. So I hope you appreciate how identification and knowledge of factors that increase risk of a particular disease can lead to intervention guidance, whether they be medical or policy mediated. So the other way to get there is to, besides identifying risk factors, is to prevent and treat people as early as possible. And here too, there are real life world examples. We talked about heart disease earlier and awareness around prevention. When you go for your annual physicals and your cholesterol levels are abnormal, the doctor will sometimes prescribe cholesterol reducing drugs, such as what you have here on the left, the statin drugs. Why does the doctor do that? You don't even have heart disease. Why are they putting you on cholesterol reducing drugs? It's because we know that high levels of cholesterol can deposit fat in your blood vessels, which makes it difficult for blood flow. And these deposits can then form clots, and that can cause you to have heart attack or stroke. The idea is that if we intervene early, we avoid or delay the disease later. Another way to allow treatment is through widespread genetic testing, and that's the middle part here. And there's a real life example of this. There's a disease called spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. It is a progressive rare genetic disease, yet it is the #1 genetic cause of infant death. If a doctor suspects SMA, they may order genetic testing. Starting from 2018, SMA has been added to newborn screening in many, many states. The reason for newborn screening is that it allows an infant to begin genetic therapy before symptoms even appear. And research is telling us the therapies are most effective at that time. Here's an example of identifying a gene mutation for a disease and then use an available gene therapy, such as Spinraza in this case, which is one example, against that mutation. And can that be used as a preventative or prophylactic or pre-symptomatic treatment? Imagine that for ALS. And frankly, you don't have to imagine that for ALS. It's actually starting to happen. So can we find that cholesterol equivalent for ALS, a biomarker that indicates that you're at an increased risk of getting ALS? And there is an exciting approach that's happening right now in ALS. And this is the Biogen's Atlas trial that's capitalizing on this idea. So just very quickly, mutations in the SOD1 gene were the first, back in 1993, were the first genetic abnormality associated with ALS. Today, Biogen is developing an antisense therapy, which is for people with ALS who have SOD1 mutations. And this is the tofersen trial, the VALOR study. However, they've also started a first of its kind prevention trial in ALS using tofersen. But it's now in the people that have the mutation, but don't have the disease yet, as in they're asymptomatic. This is the Atlas study. Dr. Michael Benatar, who's leading the study, has shown that a particular biomarker, NFL, increases in people with SOD1 mutations prior to symptom onset. So if we can use that as a gating mechanism to start prophylactic therapy, in this case, tofersen, could we potentially delay clinical onset or diagnosis, or even slow down the progression of the disease? This study is very important as it may guide future preventative treatments. Next slide. And so tofersen is just an example of how we need to discover new preventative treatments based on the risk factors that have already been identified. Our ALS Association has supported large-scale gene sequencing projects. And as a result of that, we now have 30 different genes. You can't see that on the left side here, but these are 30 different genes that are associated with ALS. We're going to focus our research on getting these genes validated so that more genetic therapies can be developed against these genes, so that we don't have just against SOD1, but we have 29 others. Imagine that if we could screen people and provide these therapies before disease starts. In the middle, you have an environmental risk factor for ALS. There are some small studies that have shown that blue-green algae, cyanobacteria in freshwater lakes and rivers have been shown to increase risk of developing ALS. And how does these cyanobacteria produce an increase in risk of ALS, that's where our research has to focus on molecular targets that can be developed into therapies and perhaps preventative therapies to mitigate these environmental exposures. And the last one here, really important, we know that the military veterans are twice as likely to develop ALS, and understanding what risk factors may be, whether it's traumatic brain injury, maybe it's smelling diesel fuels, maybe it's weapon toxicity, who knows? Here too, we can go to the biology route and understand the molecular mechanism so that eventually we can develop therapies or guidelines. If there is a particular risk factor during service which increases your risk for ALS, how can that be removed? Think about asbestos here, so that someone who is raising their hand to fight for our country is doing that without risking their life and health. You'll hear from John Robinson, who served in military and is a person living with ALS, and his unique perspective on risk and protection. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so, yesterday, Kathleen and Neil talked about the different public policy priorities. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but I just want to give you a sense of, what does increased funding for research pipeline mean? It means more funding for NIH means more funding for research into genetics and mechanisms. More funding for NIEHS means we study environmental risk factors. The CDC's ALS registry is at the forefront of risk factor research. They're collecting specimens and information on environmental exposure and making funding available to study those links and correlation. More funding for the Department of Defense means that once we identify those risk factors, we can make therapeutic targets and develop therapeutic programs against those risk factors. And even the VA has a research program that is looking at risk factors due to military service. So finally, I would like to end with, what does success look like in this? This is a new concept for us. And I'm happy that ALS Association and our team has, in consultation with our community, has made this a leading edge of our strategy for making this a livable disease. But what does the future look like? It's better risk ID so that we can potentially lead to earlier treatment and better outcomes. We support ongoing genetic testing. We provide guidance to at-risk individuals, and we work with appropriate federal and state level government agencies. So all of these things combine, and if these things happen, it will directly contribute to making ALS a livable disease by 2030. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to introduce this new topic to you.
Great. Thank you, Kuldip. I predict that you are going to be very popular in the Q&A later on today. So a lot of questions. I'm already thinking of a few things that we haven't even had a chance to discuss yet. So I'm looking forward to that. So now it is my pleasure to introduce both Dr. Ken Mankhouse and Congresswoman Diana DeGette, who are going to join us for a fireside chat. So let me just give you a little background on them before we turn the mic over. Ken is a professor of political science at Davidson College and is also a trustee on the ALS Association board. And Ken was diagnosed with ALS back in 2018. Congresswoman Diana DeGette is representing Colorado's 1st District, and thank you for joining us today, Congresswoman. She is a very influential Democratic member and a very powerful House and Energy Commerce Committee member, and really is key for all of our healthcare legislation. We've really enjoyed working with you in your office. You are now leading an effort alongside with Representative Congressman Upton and to craft a new bill, which is called Cures 2.0. And it's really focused on modernizing the FDA and Medicare. So I don't want to cut off your conversation. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you both have to say. Ken, I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Kalanit, and Representative DeGette. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
ALS is a disease that obviously has devastating impact on the individual who's diagnosed, but it also has a real ripple effect well beyond that individual, caregivers, the family members, the wider set of friends in the community. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own connection to ALS?
Yes, so thank you, Ken, and thank you, Kalanit, and to the entire organization for hosting this fireside chat. It's a personal mission of mine to find treatments and cures for ALS because, like so many families, I've been touched personally. My father-in-law, Lino Lipinski de Orloff, was an extraordinary man. He was Italian. He fought in the Italian resistance in World War II and eventually came over to the U.S. and became an artist and museum curator. He was an extraordinary man. He used to draw us little whimsical drawings on our birthday cards, on holiday cards. I have a picture on my desk when I graduated from law school that he drew me of me in a cap and gown, and there was the scales of justice, and the heart was outweighing all of the law books. That's the kind of man he was. So, of course, we were devastated when in 1988 he was diagnosed with ALS and he died. And, you know, the thing is, Ken, that I think about, and of course you do too, with your recent diagnosis, in the 30 years since we lost Lino Sr., we haven't had any real cure or substantive treatment for people who receive this diagnosis. And that's part of the reason, I know we're going to talk about this, but it's part of the reason that Fred Upton and I wrote the 21st Century Cures Act to help us develop cures and treatments for some of these really intractable diseases. And also why I'm an original co-sponsor of the Act for ALS, which I know that you have been discussing over the last few days.
Thank you for that. That does lead very naturally into the next question I had for you, which is until there's a cure, our goal in the association and the community is to make ALS a livable disease by 2030. That's only 8.5 years away. We're on the clock. And as you say, this is an intractable disease. What is your thinking on calls to increase federal funds for ALS research across federal agencies, the NIH, Department of Defense, FDA, and CDC?
Well, I think that with some of the exciting new research techniques that we have, I think that it is important that we make ALS a livable disease, but also that we don't ever give up on finding a cure, because some of the new methodologies that we have really can lead to cures in a remarkably fast way. And that's why I've always supported very robust increases to NIH funding, because we really are on the cusp of finding treatments and cures for some of these diseases. When Fred and I worked on 21st Century Cures, which we passed in 2016, we worked with all of the agencies and we gave the FDA a boost of $500 million. We gave the NIH new funding opportunities for young scientists and some special initiatives. At the CDC, we initiated the development of a national neurological conditions surveillance system. And we're continuing in the same vein as we develop the sequel to 21st Century Cures 2.0.
Thanks. Part of the challenge, of course, is raising money to fund research, but then there's also the issue of improving the process. As you know, people with ALS urgently want and need new and effective treatments and want the FDA to move faster and be more innovative for ALS. How can the FDA better foster innovation for clinical trials for rare diseases like ALS? What should we be pushing the FDA to do more?
Well, so obviously, participation in clinical trials is really key. And Fred and I are looking in Cures 2.0 and finding ways to help patients participate in a much more robust way, but always at the same time, and I always say this to everybody, not just patient advocacy groups, we have to make sure that we protect people's right to privacy and their very, very sensitive medical information. But when you ask Americans, would you be willing to allow your information, your health information, to be used for clinical trials and studies? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. And so we're hoping that we can capitalize on this in addition to some of the new technologies in Cures 2.0, because we think if we could do some of these very large clinical trials, that could actually help us find treatments and cures to diseases like ALS.
During the pandemic, expanded access to telehealth has been critically important to people living with ALS, whether it's for accessing our ALS clinics from remote, or in some cases participating in clinical trials from remote. Can you share with us what you think Congress is going to do regarding telehealth after the pandemic, and what can we do to encourage Congress to continue telehealth access for those who need it?
So it's so interesting, Ken, because as Kalanit mentioned, I've been involved in healthcare policy issues for over 2 decades now in Congress. And we have spent a lot of time on a bipartisan basis trying to talk about expanding telehealth for a lot of the reasons why you just outlined. And it was as if the pandemic fast-tracked all those conversations, because suddenly we were really forced to expand telehealth as a matter of necessity. I'll just share one anecdote. My daughter is a physician at UCSF in San Francisco, and I actually observed her doing telehealth consultations with her internal medicine patients. So it was used very widely throughout the country and on all different patients. I'm hoping, now that we've seen how we can do this, we can learn from the experience that we've had over the last 15 months, and we can actually institutionalize a lot of the telehealth. You don't want to try to do all of your medicine by telehealth, but it certainly can be very, very useful for patients who have limited access to travel for specialized services like ALS patients, or really people who don't have the physical ability to get from place to place, clinical trials, and just regular patients for routine types of medical consultations. So I know there's, a bipartisan interest in Congress in institutionalizing this, and I am committed to making that happen.
That's great news, because it's been a wonderful surprise, I think, for those of us who are working in care services, to see what an effective tool it has been.
Yeah.
You've got a big room, virtual room here, full of enthusiastic advocates, and they want to influence members of Congress to do the right thing with regard to ALS. Do you have any tips for us as to how best to influence our members of Congress?
I really do, because first of all, events like this are fantastic. It not only helps your members hear from a member of Congress what's going on, but it also helps me to hear what the new developments are and so on. But I always, let me back up for 1 minute. One piece of good news is that biomedical issues, in particular disease issues, ALS, Alzheimer's, cancer, a lot of these issues, there are robust local organizations that lobby. And I like to say all the time, disease does not have any political dimensions. Disease can impact Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliateds, and people who just don't even care. And so this is a powerful tool for advocates like your advocates. And I always tell people, get to know your member of Congress, get to know their staff. And I'm a Democrat, and I will frequently have people say to me, they'll say to me, oh, well, I'm a Republican, so you're not going to talk to me. Well, that's not true. Virtually all of the members of Congress I know on both sides of the aisle are eager to talk to their constituents of all persuasions, because the core issue that we're talking about is curing diseases that impact American families. So don't hesitate to get to know your member of Congress. And the other thing I'll say, don't hesitate to get to know their staffs, both locally in the district and in Washington, because frequently the staffs have so much institutional knowledge and great impact on their member of Congress. So become friends with them. I'm friends with all of the leaders of my advocacy groups here in Denver, Colorado, and I consider them to be part of my family.
Well, your call to and your observation that there is a good deal of bipartisan support for fighting diseases like ALS is music to the ears of a political scientist. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I hope we can build on that with our members of Congress. Representative DeGette, thank you so much for joining us. We know how valuable your time is, and we really appreciate all the support that you've given us in this quest to tame and then defeat ALS as soon as we can.
Thank you so much, Ken. Let me just say, take a look out for Cures 2.0, which should be unveiled in the next few weeks. And then I'll just ask all of your members can help us. Your first lobbying assignment is to help us lobby to see that this gets passed through the House, Senate, and signed by President Biden.
Thank you. Will do.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Back to you, Colonnade.
All right. Well, thank you for that, both the Congresswoman and Ken. I think it was a really uplifting interview, actually. Hearing some really positive energy, quite honestly, in times when maybe things from the Hill aren't as positive as we'd like them to be some days. And so I'm certainly heartened to hear what the Congresswoman had to say about telehealth. I'm sure you are too. You can take that into your days going forward as you lobby. And I know that story of the hands of justice is going to stick with me for quite some time. So with that, I'm going to send us off to a break, and we will be back here, same as yesterday, 40 minutes past the hour of whatever time zone you are in. East Coast, that's going to be 3:40, and we will start the second half of our sessions for the day. Thank you again. Really, really great information. Looking forward to the Q&A toward the end of the day. See you soon.